In the grand theater of world literature, few adventures shine as brilliantly as those we bring to life. Here on Echoes of Stories. Tonight, the darkness parts to reveal a legend. The Count of Monte Cristo by the master storyteller Alexandre Dumas. First unveiled in serial form in 1844, this immortal tale has enthralled generations. A saga of betrayal, vengeance, and a quest for redemption. The version you are about to hear is drawn from the public domain archives of Project Gutenberg, preserved in its purest form for all who seek its power. And now, the next chapter awaits. This is The Count of Monte Cristo, Episode 8. The following day, on the road between Bellegarde and Beaucaire, a man of about 32 appeared before the mayor of Marseilles. His attire was striking, a bright blue frock coat, pale nankeen trousers, and a spotless white waistcoat. Both his appearance and accent marked him as unmistakably English. He introduced himself as the chief clerk of the House of Thomson and French of Rome. For 10 years, that house had been in close partnership with the firm of Morel & Son of Marseilles. With 100,000 francs invested under their securities, he explained that troubling reports had reached Rome, suggesting the firm was near ruin. For this reason, he had come in person, seeking confirmation. The mayor admitted that misfortune had indeed plagued Monsieur Morel. Several vessels had been lost, and other financial blows had weakened the firm. As a creditor himself, with 10,000 francs at stake, the mayor refused to speak of Morel's private affairs. Yet as mayor, he declared Morel to be a man of unquestionable honor, who had always met his obligations with strict punctuality. If the Englishman wished for further details, the mayor suggested he speak with Monsieur de Beauville, the inspector of prisons, who had entrusted a much larger sum, 200,000 francs, into Morel's care. With a bow, the Englishman accepted this advice and left, his stride marked by a certain British firmness. When he reached Monsieur de Beauville, the Englishman recognized him instantly and showed surprise, as though this was not their first meeting. But Beauville, consumed with despair, seemed incapable of recalling the past. With the same composed manner, the Englishman repeated his inquiry. Beauville confessed the grim truth. His daughter's dowry, 200,000 francs, had been entrusted to Morel, with half the sum due within days. Morel had just confessed that unless his ship, the Pharaon, arrived in time, payment would be impossible. Beauville spoke with the voice of a ruined man, convinced that this was no mere suspension of payment, but bankruptcy itself. The Englishman reflected briefly and then offered to purchase the debt in full, with no discount, paying at once in ready money. Producing a bundle of banknotes, he astonished Beauville, who struggled to hide his relief. When Beauville warned that the debt was almost certainly lost, the Englishman brushed the concern aside, insisting that such risks belonged to the House of Thomson and French. All he asked in return was not a monetary commission, but something different. He reminded Beauville of his position as inspector of prisons, keeper of registers, and overseer of prisoner reports. There was, he said, a particular man he wished to inquire about, an abbé who had once been his teacher in Rome and had later disappeared. His name was the Abbé Faria. At once, Beauville recalled him. Faria had been judged mad, forever speaking of an immense hidden treasure and offering vast sums to the government in exchange for freedom. He had died only months earlier, in February. Beauville's memory was sharp because the death had been unusual. The abbé's dungeon lay close to that of a dangerous Bonapartist emissary, one of those responsible for Napoleon's return in 1815. Beauville remembered seeing the man himself in 1816 or 1817. The prisoner had left a lasting impression, his face etched so deeply into memory that Beauville could never forget it. The Englishman listened intently, a faint, unreadable smile crossing his lips as Beauville explained the curious escape attempt. The inspector described how Edmond Dantès and the Abbé Faria had managed a tunnel between their cells. But when the abbé succumbed to catalepsy and died, Dantès seized upon a desperate plan. Believing the dead were buried on land, he placed Faria's body in his own cell, climbed into the burial sack himself, and awaited removal. What he had not known was that at the Château d'If, corpses were never buried. Instead, each was sewn into a sack, bound with a 36-pound cannonball, and cast into the sea. Beauville laughed heartily as he imagined the prisoner's shock at being hurled into the waves, certain that Dantès had drowned. The Englishman laughed too, but quietly, in the reserved manner of his countrymen. From there, their discussion returned to the registers. Beauville, obliging his guest, led him into his study, where everything was arranged in impeccable order. He placed before him the records of the Château d'If, then left him in peace to examine them, while he himself retreated with a newspaper. The Englishman found the documents relating to Abbé Faria, yet his interest quickly shifted to the entries for Edmond Dantès. He studied each item carefully: the accusation, the examination, Morel's petition, and the annotations written in the margin. He recognized how the petition to Napoleon, once suppressed by Villefort, had been transformed under the Restoration into evidence against the young sailor. A note beside Dantès' name declared him an inveterate Bonapartist to be kept under strict solitary confinement. The handwriting matched that of Villefort. The additional remark beneath it seemed to belong to some later inspector, one who had felt brief sympathy but acknowledged that nothing could be done. The Englishman, calm and deliberate, slipped the original accusation quietly into his pocket while the inspector remained absorbed in Le Drapeau Blanc, unaware. Even had Beauville noticed, he would have cared little for the paper. So focused was he on recovering his 200,000 francs. At last, the Englishman closed the register with decision and announced that he had found all he required. It was time, he said, to keep his promise. He requested a formal assignment of the debt, with acknowledgement of the cash received. As Beauville hurried to draw up the document, the Englishman stood by the desk, carefully counting out the banknotes that would restore the inspector's fortune. Anyone who had left Marseilles a few years earlier and then returned would have noticed a striking change in the house of Morel & Son. Once alive with energy, the warehouse had been filled with laughter, movement, and prosperity. Clerks used to hurry through its long corridors, and the courtyard had echoed with the cries and jokes of busy porters moving bales of goods. But now, instead of that cheerful atmosphere, the place carried only sadness and gloom. Out of the many clerks who had once filled those corridors and offices, only two remained. One was a young man in his early 20s, deeply devoted to Monsieur Morel's daughter, who stayed despite every attempt from his friends to persuade him otherwise. The other was an elderly cashier, a one-eyed man known as Cockles, so well known by this nickname that his real name was almost forgotten. Cockles had remained faithfully in Monsieur Morel's service. His role had strangely shifted, for he was now both cashier and servant. Yet, he was still the same man, patient, loyal, and deeply attached to arithmetic, the one subject where he would never bend, even before his master. Numbers were his certainty, and the multiplication table lived at his fingertips. When disaster began to fall upon the business, Cockles remained steady. It was not because he lacked affection, but because he trusted the unshakable precision of the accounts. He had seen clerks abandon the warehouse one by one, like rats leaving a sinking ship, but this did not trouble him. For 20 years he had witnessed flawless payments, and it seemed impossible to him that the house could fail, just as impossible as a miller believing his river could suddenly cease to flow. The most recent payments had indeed been made on time, and Cockles had even discovered a small overbalance of 14 sous, which he carefully brought to his master. Morel, with a weary smile, placed the coins into a nearly empty drawer and praised him as the pearl of cashiers. That praise filled Cockles with more joy than a gift of 50 crowns could have done. But beneath the surface, Monsieur Morel had been burdened with worry. To meet his obligations, He had secretly sold family jewels and silver at the Beaucaire fair. This had helped him settle the last month's accounts, but it left him without resources. His credit was gone. Rumors of his difficulties had spread, and his only hope now rested on the return of the pharaoh. Another ship from Calcutta, which had departed at the same time, had already arrived 2 weeks earlier, yet no word had come of Morrel's vessel. It was in this fragile state that, the day after a difficult meeting with Monsieur de Beauville, a confidential clerk from the House of Thomson and French in Rome arrived at Morrel's office. Emmanuel, the young clerk who loved Morrel's daughter, received him with unease. Every unfamiliar visitor might be a new creditor. Hoping to protect his master, Emmanuel tried to handle the matter himself, but the stranger insisted he must see Morrel directly. With a sigh, Emmanuel summoned Cockles, who escorted the Englishman through the building. On the staircase, they met Julie, Morrel's daughter, who looked anxiously at the visitor. She hesitated, asking Cockles to check whether her father was available. The stranger reassured her that no introduction was needed, as Morrel would recognize his connection to Thomson and French. Julie turned pale and passed quietly by, while Cockles led the visitor onward. The Englishman soon entered the office where Morrel sat before a ledger, its columns filled with heavy debts. At the sight of him, Morrel closed the book, rose, and politely offered a seat. Time had changed the merchant. Once in the prime of life, he was now 50, with white hair, deep lines of sorrow upon his brow, and a weary, uncertain gaze. The visitor studied him with curiosity and interest, while Morrel's uneasiness grew under the weight of that look. The Englishman introduced himself as the confidential clerk of Thomson and French. His mission was clear. The house had payments to settle in France, amounting to hundreds of thousands of francs, and, trusting in Morrel's reputation for punctuality, they had gathered the bills bearing his signature. His task was to present them for payment and to use the funds elsewhere. Morrel sighed heavily, wiping the perspiration from his forehead. His voice trembled as he confirmed that the Englishman held bills of his. The stranger calmly laid out the figures: an assignment of 200,000 francs for Monsieur de Beauville, obligations of 32,500 francs soon to mature, and further notes from other houses that brought the total to 287,500 francs. As each amount was spoken, Morrel's suffering deepened. For the first time in his long career, he feared his own signature might be dishonored. Though his honesty and punctuality were well known, rumors had already spread across Marseilles that he could no longer meet his debts. Morrel turned pale at this brutal truth. With a voice heavy with emotion, he recalled that for more than 24 years under his direction, and 35 years before that under his father, the name of Morrel and Son had never once been stained. Yet when asked if he could still pay with the same punctuality, he admitted that everything depended on the safe return of the pharaoh. If the ship arrived, he would regain credit and survive. But if she were lost, then ruin awaited him. Tears welled in his eyes as he confessed that he might be forced to suspend payment, already preparing himself for the humiliation. In business, he explained, one has no friends, only correspondents. The Englishman, though steady, could not hide his pity. At that moment, noise echoed on the staircase, hurried steps and muffled sobs. Morrel's strength failed him, and he collapsed into a chair, trembling as the sounds drew nearer. He whispered that only Cockles and Julie held the key to the door, and indeed it was Julie who entered, her eyes red with tears. Unable to speak, she flung herself into her father's arms, begging him to have courage. Morrel asked if the pharaoh had gone down. She gave no words, but her silent nod was answer enough. When he demanded news of the crew, she whispered that they had been saved by the vessel just entering the harbor. At this, Morrel raised his hands to heaven, expressing gratitude that God had struck him alone. His resignation moved even the Englishman, who wiped away a tear. Soon the family gathered. Madame Morrel entered, weeping bitterly, followed by Emmanuel. Behind them stood a group of rough sailors, their faces weathered and their clothing ragged. At the sight of these men, the Englishman instinctively started forward, but then withdrew into the shadows. Madame Morrel took her husband's hand, while Julie clung to his shoulder. Emmanuel stood between the family and the seamen, linking them together. Morrel, gathering his courage, asked how the disaster had occurred. Emmanuel invited an old sailor named Penelon to step forward. The man, bronzed by the tropical sun, advanced while twisting the remnants of a hat in his hands. Greeting Morrel with a simple familiarity, he explained that the captain had fallen ill at Palma, but would likely recover soon. Then, as the family and crew waited in silence, Morrel urged Penelon to recount the story of the Pharaoh's fate. Penelon shifted his tobacco in his cheek, spat neatly into the antechamber, then balanced himself and began his account. He explained how the Pharaoh had been sailing steadily south-southwest after a week of calm seas, when dark clouds began to rise quickly over the horizon. He had been at the helm when Captain Gommert approached, pointing out the storm gathering in the distance. Both men agreed it looked dangerous, so the captain ordered the crew to take in the studding sails and stow the flying jib. They acted just in time, for the squall struck and the ship began to heel. More canvas was lowered until they were running under mizzen topsails and topgallant sails. Still, Penelon shook his head, warning that it was too much. The captain admitted a gale was coming, and Penelon, more grimly, feared it would be a full tempest. The storm roared toward them like a wall of dust, but the captain knew his craft and ordered 2 reefs taken in the topsails, the bowlines loosed, the braces hauled, and the reef tackles worked across the yards. At this moment, the Englishman's strong and unexpected voice interrupted, declaring that in such latitudes he would have taken 4 reefs and furled the spanker as well. His tone startled everyone, and Penelon stared at him before replying with respect. The sailor explained that they had indeed gone further, putting the helm up and running before the storm. Within 10 minutes they had struck the topsails and scud under bare poles. But the Pharaoh was an aging vessel, and after 12 hours of heavy pitching, she sprang a leak. The captain took the helm himself and sent Penelon below, where 3 feet of water had already rushed in. Pumps were manned, but the harder they worked, the more water seemed to enter. After 4 exhausting hours, Penelon, worn with despair, muttered that if they were to sink, they might as well sink outright. Hearing this, the captain rebuked him fiercely, vanished into his cabin, and returned with a brace of pistols, declaring that he would shoot the first man who abandoned the pumps. Penelon spoke with the calm authority of a seasoned sailor, recounting how the storm had abated slightly, yet the water in the Pharaoh continued to rise steadily. The captain, realizing all efforts to save the ship had failed, ordered the crew to abandon her. Lifeboats were launched, and all 8 men, including the reluctant captain who had to be physically assisted, managed to escape just as the vessel broke apart. For 3 days, they drifted without food or water until La Gironda appeared, rescuing them and bringing them aboard. Penelon swore to Morrel that every word was the truth, and the murmurs of agreement from the other sailors confirmed their ordeal. Morrel, tears streaming, assured them no blame rested upon them, and when the question of wages arose, Penelon named 3 months' pay. Morrel, with limited funds, directed Cockles to pay 200 francs each for now, explaining that times had changed and he could not offer more. The sailors, showing loyalty, accepted 50 francs, preferring to wait for the rest, moved by Morrel's gratitude and generosity. The men prepared to leave, but Penelon insisted they would wait if Morrel built more ships. The merchant, saddened, explained he had no funds to commission new vessels, and the sailors, undeterred, promised to scud like the Pharaoh under bare poles if needed. Morrel, almost overwhelmed, dismissed them with heartfelt words, allowing Emmanuel to ensure his orders were followed. Once the seamen had departed, Moral requested privacy with the Englishman, who had silently observed the scene. Julie and Madame Moral withdrew, Julie casting a pleading glance at the stranger, which he returned with a subtle, reassuring smile. Alone, Moral sank into a chair, exhausted but relieved. The Englishman, perceiving the weight of the misfortune, offered aid, revealing that he was one of Moral's largest creditors and willing to grant a delay. Moral, after reflection, requested 2 months. The stranger extended 3, assuming full responsibility and renewing the bills until September 5th at 11 o'clock, when he would collect the payment. Moral promised to pay, or die trying, his words barely audible. Grateful beyond measure, he escorted the Englishman to the staircase, where Julie waited. She clasped her hands as he passed, and he instructed her that one day she would receive a letter signed Sinbad the Sailor, which she must obey without question. She promised, blushing faintly, and he bid her adieu, complimenting her virtues and predicting a future happiness with Emmanuel. The stranger then descended to the courtyard, where Penelon stood holding rouleaus of money, uncertain whether to keep them. The Englishman called him over, indicating a private conversation awaited. The extension granted by the agent of Thomson and French, arriving at a moment when Moral least expected it, struck the poor shipowner as such a decisive turn of fortune that he almost allowed himself to believe fate had grown weary of its relentless spite. That very day, he recounted every detail to his wife, Emmanuel, and his daughter, and a glimmer of hope, if not full tranquility, returned to the household. Yet, Moral could not dismiss the broader business reality. His engagements with the House of Thomson and French were only one part of his obligations, and in commerce, as he often reminded himself, men had correspondents, not friends. Pondering the generous conduct of Thomson and French, he could find no reason for it beyond a cold, practical calculation that it was better for them to help a man who owed nearly 300,000 francs and have the debt fully repaid in 3 months than to hasten his ruin and recover only a fraction. Nevertheless, not all of Moral's correspondents shared this prudence. Some acted contrary to such reasoning. Bills signed by Moral continued to arrive at his office with exacting punctuality. Thanks to the delay granted by the Englishman, Cockles paid them with equal precision, maintaining his usual calm. Moral alone felt the strain, aware that upcoming payments, the 50,000 francs to de Beauville on the 15th and 32,500 francs of bills on the 30th, could still ruin him despite the temporary reprieve. The commercial world expected his collapse, yet when the month ended, Moral honored all his obligations with his habitual exactness. Confidence remained fragile, and many still believe his ruin was merely postponed until the next deadline. As the summer passed, Moral labored tirelessly to secure every resource. Previously, his paper had been eagerly accepted and even sought after. Now, negotiations could only extend to 90 days, and no bank would grant him credit. Yet funds did arrive, and by the end of July, he could meet his obligations. The agent of Thomson and French vanished from Marseille shortly after his visit, leaving only Moral, the mayor, and the inspector of prisons aware of his generosity. The sailors of the Pharaon, too, had found new berths and disappeared. Captain Gommard, recovered from illness, returned from Palma, and Moral sought him out to console him and provide wages the captain had hesitated to request. Descending the staircase, Moral encountered Penelon, newly dressed and evidently prospering. The sailor, embarrassed by his fine attire, stepped aside, moved his quid, and returned only a slight acknowledgement of Moral's customary hand squeeze. Moral assumed Penelon's bashfulness came from the elegance of his clothing and that he had likely secured work aboard another vessel. Perhaps he also wished to share news of his good fortune with Captain Gommard. Moral, seeing him, blessed the sailors in parting, wishing their new master to treat them well and be luckier than he himself had been. August passed in continuous effort to revive his credit. On August 20th, news spread that Morel had left Marseilles by mail coach, leaving Emmanuel and Cockles to handle the creditors. Yet, contrary to expectations, by August 31st, the house opened as usual. Cockles meticulously examined every bill and paid each with unwavering precision, including 2 drafts Morel had anticipated. The business world could scarcely comprehend such order. Once again, rumors of inevitable failure were deferred until the end of September. On September 1st, Morel returned, greeted with anxious hope by his family, who awaited news from his journey to Paris. He had considered Danglars, now immensely wealthy, whose former debts to Morel had facilitated his rise with the Spanish banker. Danglars could have saved him with a single word, yet Morel refrained from asking, instinctively delaying the last resort until the very end. Upon returning, crushed by the humiliation of refusal, Morel offered no complaint. He embraced his weeping wife and daughter, warmly shook Emmanuel's hand, and retired to his private room to summon Cockles. The 2 women turned to Emmanuel, whispering with despair, convinced that ruin had finally overtaken them. A quiet council was held, and it was decided that Julie should urgently write to her brother, stationed at the garrison in Nîmes, asking him to come without delay. The women, sensing the looming misfortune, felt they would need every ounce of strength to bear it. Maximilian Morel, though barely 22, already carried significant influence over his father. Maximilian was a determined and upright young man. His father had respected his choice in career, and he had chosen a military path. He studied diligently, excelled at the Polytechnic School, and became a sub-lieutenant of the 53rd Regiment. Known for his strict discipline and sense of duty, both as a soldier and a man, he earned the nickname, the Stoic, though many who repeated it understood little of its meaning. His mother and sister called upon him now, needing his support through the trial they felt approaching. The moment he entered his private office with Cockles, Julie noticed the man leave pale and trembling, his face revealing utter shock. Cockles hurried past her without answering, raising his hands to heaven in despair. Soon he returned upstairs carrying ledgers, a portfolio, and a bag of money. Morel carefully examined the ledgers, counted the money, and reviewed his financial position. All his available funds totaled about 6,000 to 8,000 francs, with bills receivable around 4,000 to 5,000, leaving him roughly 14,000 francs against debts of 287,500 francs. There was no way he could make even a partial settlement. Despite this, Morel appeared calm at dinner, a composure that troubled his mother and sister more than visible despair would have. He skipped his usual evening outing, staying in his office while Cockles wandered the courtyard in bewilderment, seeking comfort from Emmanuel, but finding little reassurance. Night fell, and the women, hoping he might come to them, instead heard him retreat to his sleeping room, closing the door carefully behind him. Madame Morel, restless, slipped quietly down the hall after Julie had gone to bed, peering through the keyhole. She saw her daughter there first, equally anxious. Julie whispered that her father was writing. They understood without words, though Madame Morel noticed he was using stamped paper. Fear struck her, the terrible thought of a will, but she could not speak. The next morning, Morel appeared outwardly calm, following his usual routine. After dinner, he held his daughter tenderly, though Julie observed that his heart still beat violently beneath the composed exterior. The following days passed similarly. On the evening of September 4th, he requested the key to his study from Julie. The request alarmed her, for it had always been her responsibility to keep it. Though she hesitated and feigned searching, she left to consult Emmanuel. He advised her to withhold the key and stay close to her father the next day. That night, Madame Morel listened intently, hearing her husband pacing in agitation until 3 in the morning. He finally threw himself on the bed, leaving mother and daughter to endure a tense night together, awaiting Maximilian's arrival. At 8 the next morning, Morel entered, calm but pale and worn from the night's torment. He showed his wife and daughter unprecedented affection, unable to take his eyes from Julie. As he prepared to leave, he gently instructed her to remain with her mother, despite her wish to accompany him. For the first time, Morel spoke in a tone that carried the warmth and authority of a father, compelling Julie to obey without hesitation. She stood motionless, silent, until the door opened and she suddenly felt herself embraced, a kiss pressed upon her forehead. Looking up, she could not contain her joy at seeing her brother, and in that moment, Madame Morel rose and went into his arms as well. The young man looked between his mother and sister, deeply concerned, explaining that her letter had alarmed him, prompting his immediate arrival. Madame Morel gestured for Julie to notify her father of Maximilian's arrival, prompting the young girl to hurry out. At the bottom of the staircase, Julie encountered a man holding a letter, questioning her identity with a distinct Italian accent. Hesitant and unsure, she accepted the letter after he explained it concerned her father's welfare. The letter instructed her to go immediately to a specific address, request a key from the porter, retrieve a red silk purse from a particular spot, and ensure her father received it before 11 o'clock, reminding her of the oath she had made to obey implicitly. Julie felt a surge of joy, only to notice a postscript emphasizing that the task must be completed personally and alone, the porter being instructed to deny any knowledge if accompanied by another. The warning dampened her excitement and stirred a cautious fear for potential hidden dangers, despite her innocence. Julie resolved to seek advice, yet rather than turning to her mother or brother, she went to Emmanuel. She recounted everything: the prior visit from the agent of Thompson in French, the encounter on the staircase, her solemn promise, and the letter's contents. Emmanuel insisted that she must go, offering to accompany her while ensuring she would still remain physically alone. He planned to wait nearby, ready to intervene should she encounter trouble. Julie, uncertain yet guided by his counsel, recognized that the urgency was tied to her father's safety and that her action might prevent a catastrophe. Emmanuel reminded her of the date and the looming financial obligation of nearly 300,000 francs due at 11 o'clock, far exceeding the available sum of 15,000 francs in the household. Julie realized that if the debt remained unpaid by 11, her father would have no choice but to declare bankruptcy at noon. She hastened with Emmanuel to fulfill the urgent mission. Meanwhile, Madame Morel had fully explained the dire circumstances to her son, leaving him astounded by the true extent of the family's financial peril. He rushed upstairs, hoping to find his father in the study, but found the door empty. Just as he reached the study, the bedroom door opened, revealing his father who had been only moments before in bedchamber. Morel was startled by his son's sudden appearance, pressing something hidden beneath his coat. Maximilian embraced his father, but quickly recoiled upon noticing the pistols, demanding to understand their purpose. Morel, acknowledging the grim reality, led his son to the study, where he placed the weapons on the desk and revealed the exact financial ledger. The balance was catastrophic, nearly 287,500 francs owed, and only 15,257 francs available. The sheer numbers conveyed the desperate situation without need for further explanation. Maximilian questioned whether all possible measures had been taken and learned that no other resources remained. He faced the dishonor that would fall upon their family. Yet Morel spoke of blood washing away dishonor. Resolute, Maximilian prepared to share in his father's potential fate, removing his epaulets and acknowledging the gravity of the decision. Morel, prepared to kneel in gratitude, was instead embraced by his son, the two noble hearts meeting in mutual respect and understanding. In that moment, Morel reassured Maximilian that the burden was not his fault, and the young man accepted the responsibility of living on, while fully comprehending the family's trials and the courage required to face them. Maximilian smiled, expressing to his father the deep respect he held for his honor, acknowledging that he was the most upright man he had ever known. Morel, satisfied, urged him to rejoin his mother and sister, while Maximilian, bending to receive his father's blessing, felt the warmth of the elder's hands upon his head as Morel pressed several kisses to his forehead. He imparted the strength and wisdom of generations past, reminding his son that through misfortune, Providence could rebuild what was lost. He encouraged Maximilian to protect the family name, labor with diligence, and live economically so that the estate could gradually recover, envisioning the day of complete restoration when Maximilian could look back and honor his father's final, calm actions. Maximilian, moved and yet struck by the impossibility of saving his father's life, questioned why Morel could not live. Morel explained that his continued existence would only transform pity into suspicion and hostility, converting trust into doubt. Living, he would appear as a man who broke his word and failed in his engagements, a bankrupt in every sense. Dying, however, allowed him to remain an honest, though unfortunate, man whose memory would inspire the pity and respect of the city. Morel emphasized that the dignity of death would let Maximilian hold his head high, proud of the integrity his father preserved even in misfortune. The young man groaned, but accepted the necessity, and Morel instructed him to leave him alone while ensuring that his mother and sister remained undisturbed. Maximilian's lingering hope to see his sister was denied. Morel had already taken leave of her that morning. He also conveyed a final, crucial instruction. The House of Thompson and French had shown the only mercy or self-interest that might allow the family a reprieve, offering a 3-month extension on the immense amode. Maximilian was charged to repay them first and to respect the agent, a sacred obligation his father entrusted to him. As Maximilian hesitated, standing immobile from the weight of will-over action, his father drew a parallel to the discipline of a soldier, reminding him that honor often required the willingness to face death rather than delay or shame. Maximilian accepted this reasoning with a final embrace, conveying acceptance and resolve. He departed the study, leaving Morel to a moment of quiet reflection, eyes fixed on the door, before summoning Cockles to prepare for the imminent arrival of the agent, whose appearance would determine the fate of the family's financial survival. The passing minutes weighed heavily upon Morel. The revelations and calamities of the past 3 days had crushed him, far more than 2 decades of age or toil might have done. He understood, in a series of reasoning both desperate and plausible, that he must separate himself from all he cherished, even life itself. Surrounded by devoted family yet compelled to act, he experienced the full torment of enforced resignation, eyes moist with tears, watching the hands of the clock move with agonizing speed. He picked up one of the loaded pistols, murmuring his daughter's name, then set it down to write a few final words, each moment measured not in minutes, but in the seconds that might separate life from death. At the final instant, he raised the pistol again, feeling the cold sweat of mortal dread and the tightening of his heart, until the creak of the staircase door and the striking of 11 warned him that the agent had arrived. Morel braced himself, ready for the final act, only to be interrupted by the joyous cry of his daughter. Julie appeared at that crucial moment, breathless and radiant with triumph, clutching the red silk purse in her hand. Relief and joy overtook Morel. The pistol fell from his grasp as he embraced his daughter, fully saved from the desperate fate he had prepared to meet. Morel could scarcely believe his eyes as he held the purse, realizing faintly that it had once belonged to him. One end contained the receipted bill for the 287,000 francs, and the other held a diamond the size of a hazelnut, marked as Julie's dowry on a small slip of parchment. Overwhelmed, he passed a hand across his brow, feeling as if he were dreaming. At that moment, the clock struck 11, each chime striking his heart with the weight of suspense. He asked his daughter to explain, and she recounted that the purse had been found in a small room on the 5th floor of house number 15 on the Allées de Mailhan, resting at the corner of a mantelpiece. Morel could hardly believe the evidence before him, for the purse was not hers. Julie handed over the letter she had received that morning, and Morel questioned whether she had gone alone. She explained that Emmanuel had accompanied her, though he had waited elsewhere upon her return. At that instant, a familiar voice called from the stairs, and Emmanuel appeared, radiant with joy and energy, announcing that the pharaoh had been sighted. Disbelief struck Morel as he struggled to comprehend the news, for he had thought the pharaoh lost. Maximilian confirmed the signal, reporting that the ship was indeed entering the harbor. The miraculous nature of the event seemed impossible, yet the evidence in Morel's hands, the accepted bill, the splendid diamond, was undeniable. Cockles, standing nearby, shared in the astonishment, questioning what this could mean. Morel, rising from his seat, resolved to go see for himself, hoping fervently that the intelligence was true. The family emerged onto the stairs, meeting Madame Morel, who had been too anxious to join them earlier. They made their way to the Cannebière, where a crowd had gathered on the pier, parting before Morel as news spread that the pharaoh had arrived. There, in front of the Tower of Saint-Jean, the ship lay at anchor, bearing the name, the Pharaon, Morel and Son, of Marseilles on its stern. The vessel was identical to the lost Pharaon and fully loaded with cochineal and indigo. On deck, Captain Gomer directed operations, and Penelon signaled to Morel, confirming beyond doubt the reality of the event. As Morel and Maximilian embraced on the pier, the entire city celebrating the arrival, a man concealed behind a sentry box observed with quiet delight. Half hidden by a black beard, he murmured words of blessing and gratitude for Morel's goodness, ensuring that his own assistance remained unseen. Smiling with supreme contentment, he descended to a waiting launch, calling out for Jacopo 3 times. The launch conveyed him to a yacht lavishly outfitted, where he sprang aboard with the skill and agility of a sailor, turning once to gaze upon Morel, who was overwhelmed with joy and gratitude, shaking hands with the crowd and silently acknowledging his unknown benefactor. Finally, the mysterious man addressed the sea with a declaration of purpose. Having acted as heaven's instrument to reward the virtuous, he would now wield the power to punish the wicked. With that, he gave a signal, and the yacht, responding instantly, departed, leaving Morel and his family to savor the miraculous deliverance and the return of the long-lost pharaoh.